The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic coffins. Rachel Torres pushed her cart down the corridor of Seattle General, her eyes fixed on the linoleum tiles passing beneath her feet. Third temp assignment in Raleigh. Keep the head down. Do the work. Disappear. That was the rhythm now, the rhythm that kept her alive in ways that had nothing to do with heartbeats or oxygen saturation. Her scrubs were coffee-stained at the left hip, a casualty from the break room 30 minutes ago when she'd sat alone while the permanent staff grabbed their lunches and left the moment she pulled out her sandwich. The stain didn't matter. Nothing mattered except staying invisible, becoming the kind of nurse nobody noticed, the kind who clocked in, clocked out, and never made waves that rippled back toward the Pentagon. But invisible people still had to work. And when Rachel Torres worked, something happened that couldn't be hidden, not completely. Her hands moved with a precision that didn't match her resume. Her eyes caught things that should have stayed caught. Her mind ran differential diagnoses like a chess engine calculating 17 moves ahead. Trauma Bay 3. That's where Major Holm lay sedated, his vitals displayed on a monitor that beeped with metronomic regularity. A training accident, the chart said. Combat simulator gone wrong in a Fort Bragg gymnasium. Blunt force trauma to the chest. 3 fractured ribs. Pulmonary contusion. Admitted 46 hours ago. Stable now, or as stable as a special forces operator got when his body was reminding him he was mortal. Rachel checked his full lines first. Peripheral access in the left antecubital fossa, standard 18 gauge, running normal saline at 100 milliliters per hour. She didn't need to adjust it. The line was perfect. But she adjusted it anyway, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who had inserted thousands of lines while explosions painted the sky orange in a place that officially didn't exist on most maps. Kandahar. Bagram. Forward operating base Shank, where the trauma tent existed in a state of controlled chaos and blood meant you were winning the fight against dying. Her hands were steady. They were always steady now. The trembling had been burned out of her along with the skin on her left forearm, a gift from an RPG that had come 6 inches closer than 6 inches should ever get. The scars there ran in parallel lines like railroad tracks, stories written in scar tissue that she never explained. A kitchen accident at home. A long time ago. Nobody asked twice. She adjusted the telemetry lead on his chest, checking the adhesion. His rhythm was sinus, steady at 58 beats per minute, an athlete's heart, trained for endurance and explosive force. The monitor hummed. The beeping continued. Everything normal. And then she saw the chart. Not the progress notes. Not the vital signs documentation that she'd already reviewed. The billing codes. The procedure list. The charges accrued to Major Holm's account during his stay at Seattle General. Rachel's eyes moved down the entries with the careful attention of someone reading an autopsy report. Day 1, admission and trauma assessment. Day 2, physical therapy consult. Day 3, cardiac catheterization. Cardiac catheterization. Yesterday at 14:30 hours. Performed by interventional cardiology. Catheter advanced from the femoral artery. Chamber pressures measured. Coronary vasculature visualized. Standard documentation. Full charge, $4,847. Rachel looked at Major Holm. At his chart. At his chest. At the 4 lines and the monitor leads and the intact, unbruised groin area that would carry a significant hematoma if anyone had run a catheter through his femoral artery in the past 24 hours. She looked at the note again. The timestamp. The billing code. The signature line that said, "Checking on something." Dr. Pierce stood at the entrance to Trauma Bay 3 with the posture of a man who had never doubted his right to occupy space. He was 48, maybe 50, with the kind of weathered face that came from golf courses and country club bars rather than actual weather. His white coat was pristine. His watch was expensive, a Rolex Submariner, the kind that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a trophy. Rachel didn't look up immediately. She finished reading the line item, made a mental note of the number. Then she turned, keeping her shoulders relaxed, her eyes down. Just reviewing his monitoring. Her voice came out soft, deferential. The voice of someone who knew her place. Making sure the leads are secure. Dr. Pierce stepped into the room. His cologne preceded him, something expensive and aggressive, a scent designed to assert dominance in a 3-foot radius. He glanced at Major Holm's monitor, at the steady rhythm, at Rachel's hands now folded in front of her. "He's fine," Pierce said. "We ran a full cardiology workup yesterday. Everything's normal. That's why he's being discharged this morning." Rachel nodded. She didn't mention the cardiac catheterization. She didn't mention that she'd checked the catheterization lab schedule and Major Holm wasn't on it. She didn't mention that she'd walked past the lab at 14:30 yesterday and he was in physical therapy, moving his shoulders through prescribed ranges of motion, his groin unmarked and intact. Instead, she moved toward the door. "I'll make sure he has fresh ice chips. His fur looks good for another shift." "Of course it does." Pierce smiled the way a predator smiles before it strikes. "You're just a temp. Hard to mess that up." The fluorescent lights continued their insect hum. Rachel walked past him into the corridor, her hand steady, her breathing even, her mind cataloging information the way she'd been trained so thoroughly that she could never stop doing it, even when stopping might save her life. The nurses' station was an island of organized chaos at the convergence of 3 hallways. Monitors beeped in overlapping rhythms. A pneumatic tube system whooshed, sending lab samples to the basement in pressurized capsules. 3 nurses worked the desk. Marlene, with 22 years at Seattle General, stood at the medication dispensary. Janet, 15 years, worked the computer system. And Curtis, traveling agency staff like Rachel, sat charting on a portable workstation. Rachel pulled up Major Holm's billing record on a terminal. The cardiac catheterization charge was still there, gleaming with the weight of institutional authority. She printed the page. Then she printed the day's schedule from interventional cardiology, cross-referencing the timestamp. Major Holm's name didn't appear. Not yesterday. Not any day during his admission. "Question for you." Rachel kept her voice low. "Just a simple curiosity. Nothing accusatory. The cath lab schedule yesterday, did they ever run overflow procedures? Anyone admitted but not on the official schedule?" Marlene didn't look up from the medication dispensary. "Why?" Major Holm's chart shows a cardiac catheterization at 2:19 p.m. yesterday. But he's not on the schedule and he wasn't cleared by cardiology until this morning. Janet's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. Curtis looked up from his workstation. The air in the nurse's station changed, a subtle shift in pressure like the moment before a thunderstorm rolls over flat terrain. "You're questioning the chart." Marlene's voice came out sharp. "That's not your job, Rachel. You're temp staff. You chart, you pass meds, you report to the RN. You don't audit billing. I'm just asking." "Don't." Janet turned in her chair. Her expression had closed completely. "Don't ask questions about billing. That's not nursing. That's not your role." Curtis went back to his charting. Marlene returned to the medication dispensary. And Rachel understood, they knew. The permanent staff knew about the billing codes. They knew about the phantom procedures. And they had decided long ago that knowing and saying nothing was the safer choice. The choice that kept their job stable, their references clean, their pathways to advancement unobstructed. She folded the printed pages and walked back toward the medication room. It took less than 10 minutes for Dr. Pierce to find her. He emerged from the medication room corridor like a man who had been waiting for an opportunity. His presence filled the space, not through any physical dominance, but through the sheer weight of institutional authority that moved through hospitals like gravity, pushing down on everyone beneath it. "Ms. Torres." He said her name the way someone says a diagnosis they've just confirmed. A word. Rachel turned. Her hands were empty. Her expression was neutral. The mask was in place. Of course, Doctor. What exactly were you discussing with the permanent staff? Just asking about the cath lab overflow procedures. Why? His voice dropped an octave. Not angry yet. Just the preliminary rumble before the storm. Why were you reviewing a patient's billing chart? That's not nursing, Ms. Torres. That's administration. That's something a permanent RN might handle if they were credentialed to do so. Certainly not something a temp agency assignment should be concerned with. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply waited. The patient is fine, Pierce continued. His care is complete. The billing is handled by our finance department. Your job is to ensure his comfort until discharge, which will be at 9 a.m. Nothing more. I understand, Doctor. Do you? His eyes narrowed. Because it seems to me you're taking on responsibilities that aren't yours. Asking questions about procedures. Reviewing codes. Creating doubt where there doesn't need to be any. I wasn't creating anything. I was. You were overstepping. Pierce stepped closer. His cologne surrounded her like a physical thing. That's the problem with temp staff. You come in, you don't understand the culture, the protocols, the way things work here. You start asking questions because you don't understand the bigger picture. And then the permanent staff gets uncomfortable. Morale suffers. Doubt creeps in. Rachel breathed. 1 count in. 1 count out. Her hands remained at her sides. I was just checking the chart, Doctor. Standard chart review. No. Pierce's smile returned, that predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. Standard nursing is following the care plan that's already in place. Standard nursing is not conducting unauthorized audits of billing procedures. That's what gets people in trouble. That's what gets temp assignments terminated. He walked past her then, close enough that she felt the displacement of air, the assertion of dominance. He was sending a message that would be received clearly. She had stepped over a line. Asking questions was a choice. Continuing to ask questions would have consequences. Rachel waited until he disappeared down the corridor. Then she pulled up the cardiac catheterization entry again on the nearest terminal. She screenshot it, printed it, and slid the page between the pages of her personal notebook, the one with the copper-stained cover that nobody would ever think to examine. Because the interesting thing about paper trails, the truly interesting thing, was that they ran both ways. And Dr. Pierce was the kind of man who assumed that his position, his authority, his connections, meant he could do anything without documentation turning back on him. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. Dr. Pierce entered Major Holm's room at 0900 sharp, 2 residents trailing behind like remoras clinging to a shark. His timing was surgical. Mrs. Holm sat in the visitor's chair beside her husband's bed, their teenage daughter leaning against the doorframe scrolling through her phone. Perfect audience. Rachel was adjusting the dressing on the Major's chest wound when Pierce's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Nurse Temp, perhaps you could explain why you're questioning cardiology charges you're not qualified to understand. The words carried into the hallway. Rachel's hands froze mid-motion, the sterile gauze suspended 3 inches above Holm's skin. She turned slowly, meeting Pierce's gaze with a cold, flat stare. Her jaw tightened. Nothing more. No apology. No explanation. Just that look, the kind of look that made the fluorescent light seem to dim. Pierce smiled. He had no idea what he was looking at. This is why hospitals shouldn't hire agency staff, he continued, turning to address the residents as if Rachel had already become irrelevant. His voice carried the practiced superiority of a man accustomed to obedience. No institutional knowledge. No accountability. Just temporary workers pretending to practice medicine. He gestured broadly, his hand moving like a conductor's baton. It's frankly dangerous. Mrs. Holm shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Major Holm's breathing quickened, not from medical distress, but from anger. His daughter looked up from her phone. Pierce reached into his clipboard and extracted a printed form, moving with deliberate slowness. He carried it to the whiteboard mounted above the sink and affixed it with a magnetic clip, making sure everyone in the room could read every word, a disciplinary write-up, single-spaced, detailing charges of undermining physician authority and inappropriate questioning of treatment decisions. Beneath the text, his signature was a slash of aggression. Then he pulled out his phone and photographed the document. "For the permanent record," he said, the smirk spreading across his face like a stain. "Hospital policy requires documentation of insubordination." Rachel said nothing. Her hands, however, had begun to shake. Not with fear. With the kind of trembling that comes from holding back a force that could shatter bones. She finished adjusting the dressing with movements so controlled they looked mechanical, each gesture precise and deliberate. When she stepped back from the bed, Pierce was still watching her, waiting for the protest that never came. By lunchtime, Rachel entered the break room carrying her chip pot with a dying succulent. The plant had lost another 3 leaves since yesterday, a small, growing casualty in a larger war. Jenny and Marcus sat at the center table, mid-conversation about their Saturday plans. They saw her. Their eyes met. Without a word, they grabbed their lunches, exchanged a glance that contained an entire conversation about liability and self-preservation, and left through the opposite door in 90 seconds flat. The room hummed with refrigerator sound and emptiness. Rachel sat alone at a table marked by concentric coffee rings, stains from dozens of nurses who had sat where she was sitting, absorbing the silence like a dark ritual. The break room felt cavernous. Around her, chairs sat empty. The clock on the wall ticked forward with mechanical indifference. She opened her lunch container, looked at the chicken sandwich inside, and closed it again. Her appetite had abandoned her like her colleagues had. By 1400 hours, Pierce had escalated. A second write-up appeared on the main unit board in the hallway, the one where every nurse on the floor passed during shift change. This one bore the stamp of the department administrator, as if authority itself had been invoked. The message was identical. The threat was understood. Pierce positioned himself nearby with his arms crossed, a vulture watching for movement. When staff passed the board, he observed their reactions with the precision of someone cataloguing allies and neutrals. His phone remained in his hand, ready to document anyone who showed sympathy to the temp nurse. Rachel clocked out at 16:55 and walked toward the exit corridor. She made it 6 steps. "Nurse Torres." Pierce's voice stopped her cold. He used her real name, not temp, not agency staff, which somehow made the words cut deeper. He had 3 witnesses positioned nearby. A resident, a nurse from the cardiac floor, and a hospital administrator whose presence added institutional weight to everything he was about to say. He had orchestrated this encounter the way a master tactician orchestrates ambush. "Let me be clear," Pierce said, moving closer. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and decay. "You lack the education to question billing decisions. You lack the authority to review physician clinical decisions. And you lack the competence to work anywhere but the bottom-tier facilities desperate enough to hire you." He counted these deficiencies on his fingers as if they were mathematical facts. "Your agency shouldn't have sent you here." Rachel stood perfectly still. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands hung at her sides, unmoving. The trembling that had threatened to surface while she dressed Major Holm's wound had been locked away, compressed into a core so dense that it radiated heat. When Pierce finally paused to breathe, when he waited for the response he expected, Rachel spoke. Her voice had dropped an octave. "The interesting thing about paper trails, Doctor, is they run both ways." She didn't raise her voice. Didn't gesture. Didn't move. 8 words, delivered like a threat whispered across a detonator. She turned and walked away while Pierce was still processing what she had said, still trying to calculate whether those words constituted a threat he should report or a comment he could dismiss. He chose dismissal. This was his first mistake. The corridor she walked down was lined with photos of hospital board members and donor plaques. Her footsteps echoed against tile. Behind her, Pierce stood frozen, his three witnesses carefully avoiding his eyes, already calculating distance and deniability. Rachel reached her locker, retrieved her bag, and pushed through the employee exit into the parking lot where rain was beginning to fall in heavy drops that smelled like approaching thunder. She didn't stop walking until she reached her car. Her hands, now shaking in the privacy of her driver's seat, gripped the steering wheel with enough force to make her knuckles white. She had given him a warning. A clean one. He had chosen to ignore it. At 16:20 that same afternoon, Rachel was completing her charting in the nurse's station when Major Holm's monitor alarm screamed from room 412. Not a warning beep. A full code alarm, the sound that meant death was knocking. She moved before conscious thought engaged. Her body knew this sound. Her hands knew what came after. Holm's wife was screaming. Rachel entered the room at controlled speed and saw immediately what had happened. The Major's neck veins were distended like cable, his trachea deviated sharply to the left, his color shifting from pink to an oxygen-starved gray. His chest heaved with the gasping effort of a drowning man. The surgical drain had failed. Air pocket. Pressure building. His oxygen saturation had dropped from 94 to 78 in the space of 4 heartbeats. Tension pneumothorax. Lethal within minutes if untreated. Rachel didn't call for a doctor. She snapped open the crash cart with movements so economical they looked choreographed. Her hands pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle. She counted ribs with her left hand while her right hand palpated landmarks with the confidence of someone who had done this in sandstorms and in darkness and under fire. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingers found the exact spot like muscle memory finding home. The needle went in smooth and precise. Air hissed out, the sound of pressure escaping, of death being released into the atmosphere. The hiss was almost musical. Holm's oxygen saturation climbed. 82, 88. 92, his gasping breath eased into something that resembled normal respiration. His wife stopped screaming. The monitor steadied from chaotic spike into something approaching rhythm. In the corner of the room, another patient's visitor, a man in his 50s wearing an Army veteran's cap, watched the entire procedure with widening eyes. His expression shifted from shock to recognition to something that looked like grief. When Rachel finally called for the respiratory team and stepped back from the bed, the man approached slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone handling explosives. "Bagram, right?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Rachel's spine went rigid. "I'm Chen. Former Army medic, different unit." He was studying her face like he was trying to decode a classified document. "Summer of 2019. I saw you work the trauma tent outside the wire. The convoy that got hit near the Eastern Approach Road. You saved my sergeant when we thought he was already gone." Rachel's hands, which had been perfectly steady while holding a needle inside a man's chest, began to tremble. Just slightly. Just enough that Chen could see it. "You disappeared after that Black Ops thing went sideways," Chen continued quietly. "We heard stories. Heard the Pentagon buried the whole operation. Heard your unit got burned and pulled out fast." He paused. "Heard your code name was something like." Rachel grabbed her supply cart without answering and left the room. Her legs carried her into the hallway with military precision, but her mind was fragmenting. Bagram. 2019, the trauma tent. The blood. The impossible extractions. The night the operation went dark and the Pentagon decided that Captain Rachel Torres needed to cease existing. But what happened next ended careers. The monitor alarm cut through the afternoon like a blade. 1,620 hours. Major Derek Holmes' dressing change had been routine, saline gauze swap, wound assessment, vital signs stable at 16:15. Then his oxygen saturation dropped. 94, 91. 88, the numbers fell like dominoes. Rachel was 3 rooms down when she heard it. Not the alarm itself, she'd learned to filter the constant electronic noise of a trauma floor, but the *quality* of the silence that followed. The nurse's station stopped moving. 2 CNAs froze mid-stride. Everyone who'd worked a trauma unit knew that silence. It meant something had shifted. Something was wrong in a way that machines couldn't fix with a simple adjustment. She moved without thinking. Her body was already in motion before her conscious mind caught up, feet crossing tile with the economical speed of someone who'd spent years moving between wounded soldiers in the field. The ventilator in Holmes' room wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and useless. His chest wasn't rising. Not fully. His neck veins bulged like purple rope against his throat, distended and angry. His head tilted slightly to the right, the trachea deviated, a clear sign the pressure inside his chest was collapsing his airway from the inside out. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against the heart. "Call for a chest tray," Rachel said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis. "Needle decompression. Now." The resident froze. His name was Patterson, fresh enough that his hand still trembled during procedures. "Shouldn't we wait for? He'll be dead in 90 seconds if we wait for anything." Rachel was already at the bedside, her hands moving with the fluid precision of muscle memory carved into her nervous system over 2 tours of combat medicine. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. "Hand me a 14-gauge needle." Patterson moved. The charge nurse moved. A tech appeared with supplies, muscle memory responding to authority that had nothing to do with her title and everything to do with the certainty radiating from her like heat. Rachel's fingers found the anatomical landmarks on Holmes' chest, the second rib, the space below it, the exact point where air had nowhere else to escape. She'd done this before. She'd done this under fire with mortars landing 60 meters away. She'd done this with one hand while applying a tourniquet with the other. The needle went in. The angle perfect. The depth exact. For one suspended moment there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing, shallow and controlled, and then the hiss of air escaping. Pressurized air that had been slowly suffocating him, rushing out through the needle like a valve finally opening. Like letting someone breathe again after holding them underwater. Holmes' oxygen saturation climbed. 89, 92. 95, 97. His chest expanded. His color returned from gray-blue to something approaching human. The monitor settled into a steady rhythm, and Rachel withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. "Get him to CT," she said. "Tube him if the SAT drops again. He needs a chest tube before the pneumo reaccumulates." The room moved into action, everyone suddenly remembering what they were supposed to do. Patterson was already calling for transport. A nurse was prepping the chest tube kit. The crisis was shifting from active emergency to managed complication, which meant the adrenaline could finally drain and the fear could finally surface, but Rachel didn't let it. Not here. Not with witnesses. She was turning toward the door when a voice stopped her. Soft. Cautious. From the chair in the corner where a patient visitor had been sitting the entire time, an older man in a citadel sweatshirt, gray hair, eyes that had seen their own wars. "Bagram," he said. Not a question. A statement, quiet as a prayer. 2019, I saw you work the trauma tent outside the wire. Combat Support Hospital, attached to the task force. You were, Jesus, you were remarkable. How did you, why are you? Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't afford to. She moved past him with the same efficient, emotionless gait that had carried her through a dozen compound breaches and 3 ambushes. Her throat was tight but her face was stone. The fear was there, clawing at her from the inside, but she'd learned a long time ago that fear was just another vital sign. Pain was information. Terror was data. You logged it and moved forward. She made it to the nurse's station. Made it exactly 14 steps before Dr. Pierce appeared in her peripheral vision like a hawk recognizing movement in tall grass. Miss Torres. His voice was a tank idling in a garage, heavy, dangerous, controlled aggression waiting for ignition. A word. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the language of courtesy, the way Pierce weaponized politeness. Rachel turned. Her hands were calm. Her breathing was steady. She'd been trained by people who thought the Geneva Convention was a suggestion, and she'd faced men whose idea of negotiation was a knife and an accusation. She could certainly face one mediocre cardiologist with a God complex and a vengeance fetish. "Doctor," she said. 2 syllables. Clean. Professional. Empty of everything except acknowledgement. "You performed an invasive procedure." Pierce's jaw was tight. His eyes were scanning her like he was trying to find the evidence of insubordination written across her skin. Without physician supervision. Without authorization. Without documentation from the attending. Major Holm would have gone into cardiac arrest, Rachel said. Her voice was a flat line. 60 more seconds and his heart would have stopped from the pressure. That's not the point. Pierce stepped closer, and Rachel didn't move. The point, as far as Pierce was concerned, was that she'd proven herself competent, and competence was the one thing he couldn't tolerate in someone he'd already decided was disposable. Hospital Policy 7.3.2 clearly states that emergency interventions by temporary staff require supervisory approval before. Policy also states that emergency life-saving measures override hierarchy when the attending is unavailable. Rachel had read the policy. She'd read every policy at Seattle General in the first 2 weeks of her assignment. It was what people like her did. You learned the terrain, you learned the rules, you learned the escape routes. Major Holm was moments from cardiac arrest. "I acted within scope." "You acted beyond your scope," Pierce said. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "And you did it to undermine my authority." Again. First the billing question, now this performance, this trying to show me up in front of patients and families. "I saved his life," Rachel said. "You saved your reputation, Miss Torres." "There's a difference." Pierce's smile was thin as a razor. "And now we're going to talk about liability exposure. Do you understand what kind of lawsuit Seattle General is vulnerable to if something had gone wrong? If that needle had punctured his subclavian artery? If you'd missed the intercostal space and collapsed his other lung?" Rachel had punctured subclavian arteries before. She'd repacked eviscerated abdomens in a HESCO barrier wall under fire. She'd done field cricothyrotomies with a trauma shear and a plastic tube while insurgents fired from the tree line. She understood risk management the way Pierce understood it in theory, from textbooks and malpractice seminars and the financial exposure column of a hospital balance sheet. "The major is stable," she said. "His oxygen is at 99%. His vitals are normal. He's alive because of the procedure." "Which you were not authorized to perform," Pierce said. "Come with me. Now." The command hung in the air between them like a blade suspended before the fall. Rachel could feel the weight of attention from the nurses' station, 3 nurses pretending to chart, 2 techs moving equipment with too much precision, everyone acutely aware that something was shifting. The hierarchy was being reinforced. The order was being restored. The temp nurse who asked questions and saved lives and refused to stay quiet had been marked for correction. She followed him anyway. Because refusing would confirm everything he was trying to prove. Because walking behind him through the hallway to his office meant she could keep her face neutral while he documented his version of the truth. By 1700, Pierce had filed 3 separate incident reports. Rachel watched from across his desk as he typed with the methodical precision of someone building a case. Each report was a brick in a wall. Each one cited different violations, layer upon layer of institutional ammunition. The first report cited OSHA regulations about blood-borne pathogen exposure during unauthorized procedures. The second invoked Joint Commission standards regarding physician supervision of clinical interventions. The third, the one that made Rachel's chest tighten just slightly, cited Hospital Policy 7.3.2 with specific reference language. Emergency interventions by temporary or contract staff require real-time supervisory approval or documented attestation of attending physician presence. "You performed an invasive procedure without that attestation," Pierce said, reading from the screen like he was pronouncing a sentence. Additionally, as temporary staff, you're required to have supervisory oversight for any clinical decision beyond routine nursing assessment. I was saving his life, Rachel said. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still flat. Still professional. Still empty of everything except the facts. And creating liability. Pierce hit send on the first report, and Rachel heard the soft electronic whoosh that meant it was traveling through the hospital network, landing in our inbox, beginning its journey into official documentation. Liability that the hospital has to insure against. Liability that exposes us to lawsuits, licensing actions, financial exposure. The second report went out at 17:03. The third at 17:06. By 17:15, Pierce was composing an email to the state nursing board. Rachel watched him type the subject line, formal complaint, reckless endangerment and practicing beyond scope of license. You're filing a nursing board complaint, she said. Not a question. I'm reporting what happened, Pierce said. His eyes didn't leave the screen. The state needs to know that a licensed nurse performed an invasive procedure without authorization. That's their jurisdiction, not mine. I'm simply providing documentation. The email vanished into the digital void at 17:18, another brick, another layer, another mechanism grinding forward toward a predetermined conclusion. Rachel sat in that office chair, uncomfortable, designed to discourage lingering, and felt the walls beginning their closing motion. She'd trained for this kind of pressure. She'd trained for threats and interrogation and the slow, inevitable compression of options. But this was different. This was civilian. This was legal. This was the kind of thing that didn't care if you'd saved a man's life because the policy didn't recognize saving lives. It only recognized violations. The risk management director will want to speak with you, Pierce said. Tomorrow morning. 0800, before your shift. Bring your personnel file and any documentation related to your training. Tomorrow morning. The word sat in the air like stones dropped into still water. Rachel left his office at 17:45. The evening shift was beginning its changeover, the hospital settling into its night rhythms. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant electric hum, a sound you learned to filter until you didn't notice it anymore. She walked to her locker in the break room, the place where the other nurses had learned to avoid her, where the coffee rings on the table seemed to mark the boundaries of her isolation. The cracked mug was still there. World's okayest nurse, the text faded and chipped from 100 dishwashers. The succulent, dying in its ceramic pot because she kept forgetting to water it and the humidity in the locker destroyed everything eventually. And in her backpack, under her shift clothes and her personal effects, the folded flag. The one from Kandahar. The one from 2019. The one from the teammate whose name she didn't let herself say anymore because saying it made her hands shake and she couldn't afford hands that shook. She pulled them out slowly. One by one. The mug. The succulent. The photo, tucked in a side pocket, creased and faded, her entire combat medical unit standing in front of a HESCO barrier with Hindu Kush mountains in the background. 5 people in that photo. 4 of them still alive. The cardboard box was in her car. She'd kept it just in case, because people like Rachel always kept backup plans. She placed the items carefully inside, arranging them like they mattered, like this wasn't the end of something, like walking away from Seattle General and the Major and the carefully constructed life she'd built wouldn't cost her everything. By 1930, the box was in her hands and the hospital was behind her. That was the last moment Major Holm would have allowed her to walk away. The moment when everything was still collapsing, when the walls were still closing, when the choices seemed final and the future seemed fixed in stone. He'd been watching her the entire time. He'd seen Pierce's face after the needle decompression. He'd heard the words about liability and policy and violation. He'd understood, in the way that men who'd led soldiers through impossible circumstances understand, that Rachel was about to disappear. At 1947, while Rachel was at the bus stop with the cardboard box on her lap and rain beginning to hammer the shelter like applause, Major Holm made a phone call. He used his military-grade secure line, the one connected to a satellite phone tucked in the drawer beside his hospital bed. He called a number he'd memorized 20 years ago, a number for people who didn't exist in any database, a number that connected to a voice that would recognize the call sign he was about to give. The rain continued. The bus didn't come. And Rachel sat in the darkness with the folded flag and the cracked mug and the photograph of 5 people, waiting for something she didn't know was already in motion. What happened next would take 16 hours. It would start with an emergency call back to Seattle General. It would escalate through layers of bureaucracy and classified documentation. It would end with a helicopter and a general and the entire architecture of her disappeared life suddenly, violently, undeniably real. But Rachel didn't know that yet. For now, she was just a temp nurse sitting at a bus stop, holding the last pieces of a life that wasn't hers anymore, waiting in the rain. The rain hammered the bus shelter like artillery fire. Rachel Torres sat on the metal bench, cardboard box balanced on her lap, watching water seep through the corrugated bottom. Inside, a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a dying succulent tipping sideways, a photograph of her medic unit standing in front of Phi Base Python in Kandahar, 2019, and a folded flag from her teammate who didn't make it home. The flag was still crisp at the creases. She had never opened it again. Her phone sat silent on the box beside her leg. Around 1900 hours, Dr. Pierce's assistant had delivered the termination hearing notice, 0800 sharp, Conference Room D, Seattle General Human Resources Department. The letter cited Hospital Policy 7.3.2 requiring supervisory authorization for any emergency intervention by temporary staff. It cited OSHA violations for unsupervised invasive procedure. It cited 3 separate incident reports alleging reckless endangerment, flagrant disregard for physician authority, and conduct unbecoming hospital standards. Each page was stamped, initialed, and copied in triplicate. By 1945, Pierce had filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina State Board of Nursing. Rachel knew because she'd watched him walk past her station after the major's procedure, the USB drive visibly palmed in his jacket pocket. He'd smiled at her. A wolf showing its teeth. The documentation would be ruthless. Rachel understood how bureaucracy worked. She'd seen it weaponized in different uniforms, in different languages, but the principle was identical: death by 1,000 forms. Each regulation obscure enough to require legal interpretation. Each violation vague enough to be defensible in court while suffocating in daily practice. Joint Commission standards. HIPAA protocols. The Americans with Disabilities Act somehow invoked despite having no relevance. By morning, the hospital's legal team would have briefed the HR director. By afternoon, they'd have briefed risk management. By week's end, the decision would be made quietly, officially, and with complete plausible deniability. Pierce wasn't trying to fire a nurse. He was protecting the hospital from liability. He was protecting the department's reputation. He was protecting medical authority from the erosion of institutional trust. The Route 7 bus pulled up to the shelter. Its doors hissed open like a ventilator cycling air. Rachel didn't move. The driver looked at her through the windshield, a woman in scrubs, soaking wet, holding a falling-apart box to her chest like it contained something sacred. He waited 12 seconds. Then the doors closed and the bus pulled away into the Raleigh night, its taillights bleeding red through the rain. She couldn't defend herself. That was the architecture of Pierce's trap. She couldn't argue that the needle decompression was clinically indicated without revealing why a temp nurse possessed combat surgical training. She couldn't explain her precision without acknowledging the 15 years she'd spent in surgical environments most nurses would never see. She couldn't justify her presence at that moment without disclosing classified operational history that was supposed to stay buried, erased, officially redacted into non-existence by the Pentagon's own orders. Captain Rachel Torres was supposed to vanish in 2021. The extraction from Bagram had been clean, helicopter at 0400, new identity documents by 0900, civilian life activated by noon. Guardian 6 didn't exist anymore. The Army hadn't seen fit to explain that to Major Holm when his wife called for a status report on the woman who saved his life. By 2100, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Torres? A man's voice, filtered through military precision. This is Major Holm. My wife tells me you saved my life. Twice. Rachel said nothing. Silence was safer than speech. She also tells me Pierce is destroying you for it. Holmes' voice hardened. I'm calling in a favor. You're getting called back. Emergency callback, 1632 hours, critical prisoner transfer, federal custody, requires all available trauma personnel. When you get there, someone will be waiting for you. He hung up. The cardboard box was falling apart. Rachel carried it into the Seattle General Emergency Entrance at 2,145 hours, water dripping from her clothes onto the linoleum, her scrub still soaked from the bus stop. The charge nurse didn't recognize her. The badge still clipped to her collar said temp staff. The ER director was too busy handling the prisoner transport to question why a temp nurse was being called in after her shift. They sent her to the secure wing. 2 U.S. Marshals flanked the door to the isolation room. The patient was a man in his 50s, dark-skinned, with a severe laceration across his right temporal lobe wrapped in surgical dressing. Former Taliban commander named Rashid. Head injury sustained during transport vehicle accident. Federal custody now, requiring stabilization before transfer to the Federal Medical Center. Rachel entered the room to prep him for CT scan. The monitors were already running. His oxygen saturation sat at 94%. His heart rate was elevated but stable, 88, 92, 90. No immediate crisis. Just a man in pain with a sealed wound that needed imaging. She approached the bed to check his full line. The moment Rashid's eyes focused on her face, something fractured behind them. His body went rigid. His hands formed fists and he began screaming in Pashto, his voice fractured and raw, Malaika. Malaika. The angel. The angel of Bagram. The marshals stepped forward, hands moving toward their weapons. Rachel didn't flinch. She'd heard this name before. She'd heard it whispered in field hospitals and compound ruins, passed between insurgent fighters like a prayer or a curse. Malaika, Rashid gasped, switching to broken English, tears streaming from his eyes. You saved my brother when the Americans bombed the compound in Loga. You carried him through fire. We were told not to shoot you. The commander said you were protected by God. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. His face shifted through 3 expressions in rapid sequence: concern, realization, and then something that looked like hunger. Rachel's hands remained steady. He's in pain. His wound needs imaging. Nothing else matters right now. Nothing else matters, Pierce repeated softly, a smile curling at the corner of his mouth. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling hospital administration. I'm calling the federal marshals. I'm calling the FBI. You're a military operative impersonating a civilian nurse. You're operating under a false identity. You have no credentials, no licensing, no authority to be in this hospital at all. The marshal's radio crackled. Someone on the other end was reporting the situation. 2 minutes passed. Then his phone buzzed. His face went pale as he read the message. All personnel stand by, he said quietly. Someone's coming. The elevator doors opened at 2,201 hours. Boots on tile, sharp and precise. A 2-star general in full dress uniform strode into the secure wing with 2 aides. The marshals came to attention. The medical staff froze. General Michael Corrigan, Pentagon liaison, walked directly to Rachel and rendered a formal salute, holding it. Captain Torres, he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. Major General Corrigan. Operation Graveyard was officially declassified at 0600 this morning. The Pentagon sends their regards. Rachel returned the salute. Her face remained locked in that careful mask. General Corrigan continued, your code name is cleared for acknowledgement. Among Allied forces, you were designated Guardian 6. You held 5 base Python's primary triage station alone for 16 hours under sustained enemy fire while the remainder of the medical team evacuated. He paused. 18 Allied personnel received trauma care under your direction. 7 enemy combatants received the same. 3 of those enemy combatants survived to surrender rather than die. Your service record has been reclassified. You are hereby notified that your citation for the Navy Cross is being made public. Pierce opened his mouth to speak. One of the general's aides turned to him with a tablet. This is footage from the hospital's internal security system, the aide said coldly, playing video of Pierce berating Rachel in Major Holm's room. This was forwarded to the Pentagon at 2200 hours. It reached Dr. Harrison Webb, your medical school mentor and current dean of Johns Hopkins University, approximately 30 minutes ago. Pierce's skin drained of color. His mouth opened but no words came out. Your medical license is currently under review, the aide continued. Your employment contract with Seattle General will be terminated as of 23:59 hours. You're being referred to the Medical Board of North Carolina for investigation into fraudulent billing practices and institutional abuse. The silence that followed was the kind that exists after an explosion, thick, suffocating, absolute. Rachel set her cardboard box on the nearest chair. The folded flag was still dry. She pulled it out and held it for a moment, the crisp white cloth bright against her hands. Then she placed it gently on the shelf above Rashid's bed, where it could see the 4 lines and monitors and the Major in the adjacent room who had called her back into the light. Major Holm didn't let her leave without a fight. Not because he was the kind of officer who couldn't accept an order, he could, would, but because he'd spent 17 years identifying which battles were worth winning, and this one mattered. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone on his bedside table, the trembling not from fear but from restraint, the same restraint that had kept him alive through 3 tours in the Korengal Valley. He punched in a number he'd memorized decades ago, the kind of number you don't write down, the kind you carry in your bones. His former commanding officer answered on the first ring. "Sir, we have a situation," Major Holm said, his voice steady despite the pain medication dulling his edges. "There's a nurse here. Former military. She's about to vanish, and the Pentagon needs to know why." 23 minutes later, the number was passed upward. Then upward again. By the time Rachel pulled away from the curb at the rain-soaked bus stop, her cardboard box on her lap, the machinery of the United States Department of Defense had already begun to turn. 16 hours. That's how long she held the vigil in her head, 16 hours since she'd walked into Major Holm's room and recognized the weight of command in his eyes, the same weight she'd carried through surgical tents in Helmand Province. The rain hammered the bus stop shelter like mortar fire, and she held the cardboard box closer, feeling the weight of the folded flag inside, the cloth that hadn't seen daylight since the day she'd learned her teammate's name was being read at a memorial service she wasn't authorized to attend. The bus pulled away from the stop at 11:41 p.m. By 2:15 a.m., her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something in the rhythm of the ring felt military, sharp, precise, the kind of urgency that doesn't wait for voicemail. "Captain Torres," a voice said. Not a question. A confirmation. "This is Colonel James Reeves, Joint Operations Command. We need you at Seattle General. Emergency prisoner transfer inbound. Medical emergency. You're the only one who can handle this case." The line went dead. Rachel sat in the dark of the bus, her hands perfectly still, and she understood. Holm had called. Somehow, impossibly, Holm had reached people who remembered her name, people who still had her classified file, people who knew what she could do when blood was pooling and time was running out. She got off at the next stop and caught a cab back to the hospital, her cardboard box still on her lap, the flag inside it finally about to see the light. She pushed through the ER doors at 3:42 a.m. No one stopped her. The charge nurse had already been called. The trauma bay was prepped. And then the prisoner arrived, wheeled through the double doors by U.S. Marshals, his head wrapped in gauze, his left pupil blown wide, epidural hematoma, probably critical, the kind that kills you in the window between arrival and OR. The marshals positioned him, stepped back, and then the prisoner's eyes opened. They locked onto Rachel's face. His body went rigid. "Malaika," he whispered. Then louder, "Malaika. Malaika." The room froze. The monitors kept beeping. The ventilator kept wheezing. But every nurse, every doctor, every marshal in that trauma bay went absolutely still. Because they didn't know. They couldn't possibly know. But the prisoner, a former Taliban field commander named Rashid Hakimi, a man who'd spent 3 years in Kandahar planning IED attacks on coalition forces, he knew exactly who she was. He'd heard the stories whispered in the mountains. The American medic who extracted wounded from both sides. The one who treated insurgents and soldiers with the same steady hands and cold precision. The one they called the Angel. "Malaika. You're going to be fine," Rachel said quietly, and her voice in that moment was completely different, no deference, no apology, just command. She was already moving, gloved hand steady, eyes tracking the monitor. "Get me a CT head, stat. Push 20 of mannitol for now. I need neurosurgery prepped for emergency evacuation hematoma." The orders came out like they always had, like she'd never stopped giving them, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Seattle General as a temp nurse, Rachel Torres didn't ask. She told. Captain Martinez, the hospital's senior Marine liaison, was standing in the corner reviewing the prisoner transfer documentation on his tablet. His face went absolutely pale. He scrolled up on the secure network, pulled up a classified file that hadn't been accessed in 4 years, and the words appeared on his screen in that strange, flat military language that barely captures what it means, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in support of Operation Graveyard. Captain Rachel Torres repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to provide life-saving trauma care to wounded coalition personnel and civilian non-combatants. Despite significant personal risk and against explicit orders to remain at base camp, Captain Torres conducted 5 separate emergency casualty evacuations under direct fire, resulting in the preservation of 7 lives including 3 Afghan civilians. Her actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and the medical profession. He read it aloud. His voice shook slightly on the word heroism. Dr. Pierce was still in the hospital. Of course he was. He'd filed the paperwork personally, scheduling Rachel's termination hearing for 0800, and he'd wanted to be there to watch it happen, to see the look on her face when she realized that a temp nurse, a woman who dared to question his billing practices and threaten him with consequences, was about to be erased from his institution. He'd been in the physician's lounge drinking terrible coffee and reviewing his incident reports when his pager buzzed. Code blue, trauma 2. Then another buzz. Code activation, all attending staff, trauma 2. He'd put down his coffee and headed toward the trauma bays, expecting routine. What he found instead was a room full of marshals, a prisoner with a head injury, and Rachel Torres moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent years moving between life and death. He'd opened his mouth to demand jurisdiction, to reassert his authority, when a man in dress blue stepped in front of him. 2-star General Marcus Corrigan, fresh from the Pentagon, his dress uniform still carrying the slight crease from the helicopter ride. He'd landed on the pad 20 minutes earlier, escorted by 2 aides and an aide-de-camp, and he'd come directly to trauma 2. He looked at Rachel, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from understanding you're standing in the presence of someone who'd done things most people could only read about in classified reports. He rendered a sharp salute. Not casual. Not perfunctory. The kind of salute you render to someone who's carried your people out of the dark. Captain Torres, he said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that makes rooms listen. The Pentagon sends their regards. Operation Graveyard is officially declassified as of 0600 this morning. Your code name is cleared for full acknowledgement. Guardian 6. That's the name they whisper in briefing rooms. That's the name in the files that are no longer sealed. Pierce's mouth opened. He tried to speak. She violated, she performed unauthorized procedures. The general turned to him with the expression of a man who'd seen actual enemies and found this one wanting. Doctor, you attempted to terminate a decorated combat veteran for saving a Special Forces officer's life. Twice. He paused. Twice, and she succeeded both times while you were filling out paperwork to fire her. The room went dead silent. Major Holm's wife pushed past the marshals, tears streaming down her face, and she looked directly at Pierce with the fury of a woman whose husband would have died on his watch. She saved him, Mrs. Holm said. She stayed. She kept him alive while you were worried about disciplinary write-ups and billing codes. She stayed. Rachel's phone buzzed. Then the CEO's phone. Then Captain Martinez's secure tablet lit up with an alert. The security footage was spreading. The footage of Pierce berating Rachel in Major Holm's room while the family watched in horror. The footage of him humiliating her in front of a decorated officer. The footage was moving across encrypted military networks, reaching Joint Operations Command, reaching the Inspector General's office, reaching every place where people cared about how subordinates treated their people. And in Boston, at Massachusetts General Hospital, it reached the office of Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief of medicine, the man who'd mentored Pierce through med school, the man who'd written the letters of recommendation that had gotten Pierce his position at Seattle General. Webb watched the footage once. Then he picked up the phone. Helen, he said to the Seattle General CEO who'd arrived at a near run, her phone showing the same security feed spreading across military social media. I'm filing a formal complaint with the State Medical Board regarding Dr. Pierce's conduct and the billing irregularities he's been concealing. I'm also requesting that you initiate an immediate audit of his charges from the past 18 months. And I'm personally requesting that you accept Rachel Torres's full-time employment offer. Whatever she wants. Whatever she needs. She's the only person in this situation who actually behaved like a medical professional. The CEO turned to Pierce. She didn't yell. That was the terrifying part. Her voice was absolutely flat. Dr. Pierce, security has identified 17 phantom billing codes you've authorized in the past 6 months. The FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division received an anonymous tip approximately 1 hour ago with detailed documentation. You're suspended effective immediately pending investigation. Pierce's phone rang. He looked at the screen and the color drained completely from his face. Webb, medical school. It rang for more times while everyone watched. He didn't answer. His hands were shaking now, real shaking, not restraint, not composure, just pure panic. Because he understood, finally, that he'd picked a fight with someone he couldn't see, someone whose authority transcended his title, someone whose value existed in a space he didn't have access to. Chen stepped out of his room in the adjacent trauma bay, still wearing his hospital gown, and he held up his phone. I recorded you threatening her in the break room, he said quietly. Seemed like the kind of thing that might matter later. He'd served with the 160th SAW in 2019. He'd seen Rachel extract a wounded soldier under direct fire while she herself was bleeding from shrapnel wounds. He'd waited for years to see if she'd ever be able to tell that story without dying for it. Now she could. The general's aide was already reviewing the incident reports Pierce had filed, his eyes narrowing as he read. Sir, these citations appear to be fabricated. Policy 7.3.2 doesn't exist in Seattle General's Procedures Manual. He held up the tablet so everyone could see, paragraph after paragraph of violations that didn't exist, procedures that weren't real, a carefully constructed fiction designed to justify firing Rachel before she could speak about the billing fraud. Security arrived. Not one officer. 3. They flanked Pierce with the kind of professional courtesy that indicated they knew what they were doing. He backed toward the elevator, but the U.S. Marshals were stationed there for the prisoner transfer. He was trapped. Trapped in a hallway filling with people he'd humiliated, ordered around, underestimated. Trapped by his own paper trail. Dr. Pierce, the CEO said, and her voice cut through like a scalpel, you're escorted off the premises. Don't return. Your personal items will be boxed and shipped to your home address. As the officers took his arms, gently, professionally, his phone buzzed. A text message. Visible on his screen for everyone to see, your actions are a disgrace to this institution and to medicine. I will testify against you personally. H.W. His mentor's final words. The man who'd built his career had just burned it down. 6 months later, Rachel stood in a different room. Not a trauma bay. Not a break room where people abandoned her. A recovery room at the VA hospital, where Major Holm was learning to walk again, his daughter helping him complete laps around the space, his wife watching with eyes that no longer held the terror of almost losing him. The folded flag from Rachel's fallen teammate rested on the shelf now, no longer hidden in a locker but displayed where the morning light caught it, where it could see the 4 lines and monitors and the man whose life was worth saving. News articles decorated the desk. CPR instructor's medical license suspended pending trial. Former chief of medicine faces federal fraud charges. Raleigh Community College confirms new hire, Dr. Martin Pierce, $18 per hour. His name had become what she'd always known it would be, a cautionary tale about what happens when you pick a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose. Rachel's new position, Director of Emergency Medicine at Seattle General. Her office wall displayed the silver star next to her nursing credentials. Her service record was finally public. Her code name was no longer whispered in classified briefings but acknowledged in official ceremonies. General Corrigan had asked her to train combat medics at Fort Bragg 1 weekend per month. Chen visited weekly, bringing other veterans who wanted to meet the Angel of Bagram, the woman they'd only heard about in stories, and now she was real. Major Holm paused his walk, catching his breath, his daughter steadying him, and he asked the question he'd been carrying since that night in the trauma bay: why'd you come back? You could have taken the bus, disappeared. You knew Pierce was destroying you. Rachel looked at the flag on the shelf, its folds perfectly aligned, and then back at the Major. Her voice was quiet, not deferential, not commanding, just honest. 16 hours holding a triage station taught me something in Kandahar, she said. The mission isn't finished until everyone who can be saved is saved. Even when it costs everything. Especially then. From the hallway, 3 nursing students watched Rachel work, taking notes, seeing something they'd never seen before, a woman moving through a patient's care with the kind of precision that only comes from knowing exactly what death looks like and refusing to let it win. One whispered to another, "That's Captain Torres. That's Guardian 6. She stayed 16 hours at Seattle General while the whole system tried to destroy her. Then she came back. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more tales of unrecognized heroes walking among us. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this with someone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room might just be carrying the weight of everyone else's survival.